Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sergio Lugo, and I'm here to give you a presentation on the Condor Sindicato of Brazil, an airline that existed between the 1920s and 1941. I'm doing the presentation for the American Airmail Society and the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library. This is a revamp or a modification of our original Zoom presentation, which lasted about an hour and 30 minutes. In this modification, we've gotten it down to about 45, 47 minutes. We've done that by editing the original Zoom presentation and adding the questions that were raised at the very end of this presentation. Okay. The questions are presented by Gary Withrow, who has been the collaborator on any of the Zoom meetings we've done here, for a year and a half. He poses the questions that was raised by folks, and I try and respond to them, together with any additional comments that are necessary. With that, let's go ahead and get started. The Syndikat Condor. I don't know how many of you are familiar with air services in South America. This is one of several interests of mine in the Latin American area. I have put together programs and exhibits on something called Stepping Stones to South America, for example, and that involves the evolution of U.S. airmail down to South America, beginning in the 1920s and continuing through the jet age. I am currently finishing up on something called the Winchester airmail stamps of the 1930s. The other interests extend in those areas around South American airmail. The Syndikat Condor was the first effort on my part in the aerophilatelic world. My presentation is not a full-blown, down to the minute, every flight that was flown by Syndikat Condor. It's a survey, taking some of the materials and putting them into a proper context in which I provide details. We decided we had to break this down into at least two parts. The first part deals with Brazil and other Condor connections and continues through about 28 slides. Part two may be the continuation of the Zeppelin flights, catapult flights, airmail rates, and what was also known as Lati, the Italian airline that surfaced South America during the absence of Lufthansa at the outset and the continuation of World War II. It was a natural extension dealing with Condor. I'm going to start with a handbill that was distributed in 1929 by the firm of Syndikat Condor, the Condor Airlines, and I'll just continue to refer to it as Condor as opposed to Syndikat Condor. This handbill was in the 1929-1930 period and was really basically saying to its customers, hey, take our airline if you're traveling and don't keep us waiting. That's basically it. The expression that's stated underneath the face of the map, hey, we'll take you any place. You don't need to keep us waiting. The firm began in 1924, as you can see from my notes here, but it basically came down to the Syndikat Condor. Now, I don't think I have to probe very far with very many of you as to why German industry was particularly interested in this field in 1924. Anybody?
The canal.
That was one.
No one else was interested. No one else was interested.
That's another. What's another? It should come fairly quickly to all of you.
Well, they couldn't produce because of the Versailles Act. They were kind of shafted, so they were trying to build their aircraft through other countries.
There you go. There you go. And the Germans found ready acceptance in one part of the world, that being South America.
Okay.
And it had everything to do with the terrain and features of South America that did not lend themselves to road or railroad transportation, folks. Every one of you identified a factor that was behind the development of Condor. But the one that really stands out is the inability to get around as easily as you could on the plains of North America, or through the rivers of North America, or through the non-jungle areas of Africa. And the Spanish or the South Americans were receptive to it, especially if you had foreigners that were interested in funding it. And so the Syndikat Condor began its operations as a Syndikat Condor of Berlin, and it began in its operations in, of all places, in Colombia. And I think you all know the history and the story behind SCADA. I'm not going to try and state what SCADA stands for, etc. But first development was there in Colombia. Now, let's not ignore the rest of Brazil, the South America, because the Germans are also exploiting opportunities in Chile with something called LAN, in Bolivia with something called LAB, for initials for the Bolivian Airlines, and in Brazil. Meanwhile, I think you also know that the French are trying to exploit opportunities through their firm, Aeropostal. But the Germans begin in 1924, there in Colombia with SCADA. And for those of you that don't recognize the extent of what Condor became, it became a rival, and a real rival, to what eventually evolved as Pan American. Its control of airspace, its arrangements through Brazilian development and government allowed it to expand and continue to expand into the early 1940s. Condor seeks to expand, and by the way, what I'm going to be doing here is focusing in on my bullet points down below. And then we've got bullet points and information on the top, and in the center you've got a cover or materials that highlight the cover that I'm talking about. About slide 12 or 13 will present a map configuration of the routes of South America flown by Condor, so that some of you have a chance to catch up with it. But I'll start there at the bottom and then filling you in on the bullet points. SCADA is looking for more powerful airplanes, and Condor Syndikat is operating with them in that effort. Condor purchases 2 Dornier-Wahl flying boats, and I think some of you realize that some of them were the rivals of Martin and Boeing in terms of the flights, etc. And the Wahl flying boats were employed by South American Airlines as the most convenient. After all, you didn't have airports, landing strips, and everything else like someone was talking about that they were flying throughout the world. The flying boats were a convenient means of travel and a convenient means of landing. SCADA begins increasing its Colombian service, but runs into an unforeseen difficulty. And that was, as someone has already mentioned, the Panama Canal. The United States Army Air Force, and specifically one Hap Arnold, was opposed to airlines flying in or around the Panama Canal that were controlled by foreign adversaries, or at least recent adversaries. And so the United States Army Air Force eventually opposed the petition of SCADA to be allowed to fly over the Panama Canal to get into Mexico and Central America. This leads the Germans into some of the other fields that we're talking about of the rest of South America. These are survey covers of, different flights, etc., not necessarily of the first flights, because the first flights are hard to get a hold of. I do have some, but not necessarily all. Here I have an example of a flight in 1928 between Porto Alegre and Rio de Janeiro. The first flight had occurred back in 1927 with 20 covers. The first flight from Rio Grande to Rio de Janeiro had actually taken place in 1927 from Pelotas to Porto Alegre and Santos. For those of you unfamiliar with Spanish, Pelotas refers to bull, Santos refers to the saint, and Porto Alegre, I'm not sure. If I tend to think of it as happy port, okay? But I'm not sure if that's what the exact meaning is here. Now, you'll see the cover, and the cover may be hard to distinguish from. This was a real problem for us, folks. We were really apologetic. We tried to make them as big as we could, but we couldn't. It's franked with 3 stamps. And for those of you unfamiliar with Brazilian airmail, they had an unusual arrangement. You had a regular government post for domestic mail that was assessed to all mail, whether it was airmail, sea post, land mail, or anything else along this line. So you had 1 stamp to pay for the government rate, and in this instance, it was 300 reais. And in addition, you had this mail paying an airmail fee, so that the total rate for distances, in this case 500 to 1,000 kilometers, was 2,300 reais. 300 reais to the government and 2,000 reais that was paid to Condor, not to the government, to Condor, because Condor is collecting the fees for the mail. So Syndikat turns over the flying boat Atlantico and technical support to an airline that eventually grows to become the other major airline, and that is Varig, V-A-R-I-G. Varig operated into the 1960s in Brazil, and it had started in Rio Grande do Sul. Varig had been seeking improved equipment and staff. As a result of turning over the Atlántico, Condor gets 21% ownership in Varig. This stuff wasn't free as far as they were concerned. They were trying to build up their airline's capacity. The Atlántico goes into service in January of 1927 between Rio de Janeiro and Florianópolis. The first flight carries the Syndikat representatives as well as the Minister of Transport of Brazil, whose name happens to end in Condor as well, spelled with a K. But remember, Syndikat Condor was not named for him. That was the name that they had adopted in 1924. I don't know why they picked Condor. He was so impressed with the flight that in January of 1927, he authorizes Condor for 1 year to operate the Atlántico between Porto Alegre, Pelotas, and Rio Grande. Now, talking about the cover, you'll see it there. The cover is a Rio Grande to Sol via Porto Alegre. Now, this one, you can barely see it, but it involves both Condor and Varig. The cancellation on the right is a Varig cancellation, and on the left, a Condor. The first continuous flights had begun in November of 1927. The franking is 1,300 reais. Again, the 300 reais government rate on the left and the 1,000 on the right. which was paid for 500 kilometers. Such an envelope is a prize one because of the early connection between the two airlines. Syndikat Condor purchased another aircraft, but Condor is forced to shut down because of its takeover by Varig. Apparently, the 21% ownership wasn't enough to convince Varig that they wanted to own a Condor. And so Condor went out of existence. But now it's recreated as a separate Brazilian company and officially registered as a separate Brazilian company in December of 1927. The cover itself is again one from Rio de Janeiro to Rio Grande do Sul. There is an auxiliary marking on the back which says the same thing as the earlier handbill said. Don't make your recipient wait. Respond via Air Condor, and you can see the example down below. I don't need to keep on going over the rates for you, but in this case, you've got 4,500 in reais being paid, and the Condor stamps continue to be used for the distance of 3,000 to 4,500 kilometers.
Sergio, a question on this particular cover. I see that the ordinary government rate is now 500 reais.
Yes.
Was that a rate change, or is this for a different rate altogether?
This is a rate change. This is a rate change, and don't hold me to it, but it seems to be it's in late 1928. Now, remember, it's Condor that's controlling it, and Condor that's given the money to the Brazilian government. But I'm not sure what kind of interaction there was on the part of the Brazilian government saying, we want you to increase the rate. I don't know, whoever's asking the question, but it was a rate change. There's another rate change that occurs about 2 years later. And again, that's in the rate change section, but about 2 years later, the rate goes up to about 1,000 reais. Thank you for the question. At this point, basically in January 1928, Condor receives permission to fly routes throughout Brazil. Now, I think several of you have been down to Brazil, but I think you all recognize that the territory of Brazil is almost as large as the continental United States. So we're talking vast distances from all the way down south, all the way up to the French Guiana or the Dutch Guiana border. You're talking almost a flight distance of 3,000 miles along the coast. Now, remember, you can cut across Brazil and cut that 3,000 miles down to something really responsible. But that area is all covered with jungle. Well, much of it is, and no one dares risk flying across that jungle in the airplanes of that time. So the route is along the coast for quite a while. Brazil does something differently, what Condor does. What the connections here are between what appears to be a government agency and a semi-government agency in the form of the company Condor. What they do is fix the endpoints, the terminuses of the routes. So, as far as they were concerned, in a comparable situation, you're going to fly from New York to Los Angeles. And you fix those, and that's what your goal is. And then you fill in stops on the way. I think you recognize in the case of the United States and many other countries, their terminuses extend outwards as they expand their bases. New York, Philadelphia, Belfont. But the United States and Brazil differed into how they wound up extending their connections throughout the country. In June of 1928, experimental flights are flown to the furthest Brazilian cities. The coastal route is completed around this time, and it's to Natal. Now, for those of you familiar with Brazil and Africa, you know there's a Natal, Brazil, and you know there's a Natal, Africa, and they're virtually opposite each other on the, the latitudinal scale of latitudes, okay? Also, in June, the connections begin via the Atlantic to Africa and hookup service to the Europeans, to European airlines. Those begin through plane, ship, plane connections, then Zeppelins, then catapults, and those are part of Part 2. In this instance, the cover covers, again, Porto Alegre to Pernambuco, and some of you also know Pernambuco as Recife. Well, I don't really know how the Brazilians pronounce it, Recife. That's the way I would tend to pronounce it in Spanish. Recife becomes one of the terminuses of FAM 6 and 10. Once FAM 6 and 10 were inaugurated by the United States in 1928 and 1929. And that's where I go into the stepping stones of South America about U.S. flights. Now, I'll just touch upon it for a moment. Keep in mind that United States Airlines are expanding their service step by step by step by step, all the way down the coast of South America and Brazil. And Panagra is doing the same on the West Coast. So there is a mutual rivalry that is already developed here between Condor and Panama as early as 1928. The rates you can see, the franking is 2,300. Reyes, you have to excuse me on one point here, and you'll see the MP marking. It's a little bit upside down. When I did this research, we go 15 years ago, I kept on running across two interpretations of what MP meant. And I'm never quite sure what it meant. One meaning was it was short of the required franking for the distance involved. Okay, this was carried on probably a nearly 4,500 kilometer flight to connect with FAM 10. The other meaning that I ran across, and I've not been able to justify it, I've never been able to really get it, was carried by hand or carried by another way between the airline linkages. And I think that's similar, but I'm not sure. It's similar to the word, what is it? Come on, Gary, you and I were talking about Jusqua, J-U-S, anybody? J-U-S-Q-U-A?
Jusqua.
How's it pronounced?
Jusqua.
Jusqua. Okay. You see, I think there are two meanings, but I'm not confident of that.
Just as far as.
Just as far as. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think it has a similar meaning, but I'm not sure.
Sergio, if
Yes,
I
sir.
could interrupt, by that point in time, the Jusqua mark, which was for the most part, a red parallel set of slashes, was already in use. So I'm not certain that this would have been an indication of a Jusqua mark, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, so you're indicating, Gary, that this would become standardized throughout the world, and MP probably did not mean that at this point.
That's what I'm speculating because of the frequent and widely distributed occurrence of the Jusqua mark as those two parallel lines, or sometimes it was an X, but you know, I've never seen an example of something other than those two kinds of marks to indicate Jusqua. I mean, it
Well,
certainly
and
could be.
Yeah, and let me suggest that the Gisquois marks were generally placed over something like an airmail etiquette to tell you that that service was not being provided. So in this
That's
particular
right.
case, you're not telling somebody that you're not doing something. If you'd had an etiquette on here, you could be Xing it out or putting the Gisquois marks on it. But in this case, maybe that is what it means. I don't know.
With respect to the point, I really do appreciate the clarification on that. I could not pin this down about 15 years ago. And by the way, Gary, I didn't know what Gisquois meant 15 years ago. Okay? So thank you
Sergio,
for your comments, both of you.
Sergio,
Yes.
did Condor run into any restrictions on cabotage rights?
Help me out. What do you mean by cabotage?
The rights to fly over the country.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They had to negotiate with other Latin American countries, and we'll get into that with the other countries. It never had any permission, as far as I know, to extend beyond into the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico. It did get cabotage rights to the rest of South America.
No, cabotage was for a country.
Yeah, to fly over Bolivia, Argentina, and Uruguay.
Bolivia had no restrictions. Argentina had no restrictions.
Well,
But Brazil did.
Yeah, but they had to still negotiate to send
contracts, yeah.
Yes, they had, and this was extended processes that I'll talk about that, as we get along, once we're done with Brazil. Is that okay?
Okay, no.
Okay, we'll get to it. Okay, moving right along. Here you got a really terrific little cover. I don't have much to explain to it. You'll see the MP appears again. It's Pelotas to Sao Paulo in 1929. You'll see the rates are basically the standards that we've talked about.
That's internal mail, though, right?
This is internal mail. This one is
So
internal mail.
you still got the MP on it, though.
Yes. It's still got the MP. So it fits along with what Gary and David were saying, that it had no bearing on Gisquois. Okay? Here we begin with some other stamps and some specialty stamps, again, that we talk in part 2. This is the first day cover. For the stamp, it's at the upper right-hand corner. And that stamp in the upper right-hand corner pictures Victor Condor. There were 20,000 of these made. It was a 2,000 Reyes stamp. The etiquette at the upper left-hand corner is the common garden variety version of the etiquettes, and I give you some of the etiquette numbers in a few moments. Here, the franking you can see is 3,700 Reyes. You'll rarely see. First off, you'll see the registration stamp, which was a Condor stamp, as I recall, with the big R placed on it. And it seems to me there were 3 of these stamps. I think I get into part 2 a little bit more. It paid for the 1,000 kilometers, and it paid for an envelope weighing up to 20 grams. So you got the ordinary government rate, and then you got the aviation rate. You have another one without discussion of a lot of things at the bottom. This one is a flight from Rio de Janeiro to Natal. There's the registration. There's the etiquette. And this one is not the common variety one. And for those of you that like all of this kind of stuff, you'll see that I give you the assigned number of BRA-B-1 in the Postal Label Study Group. I did mention to you I was president of the RMPL for a number of years, 6 years, and I've been a founder and been heavily involved till about 7 years ago. And I always read. Nothing like having a philatelic library just a couple of miles from home. And like some Spanish baseball player said once before, the library has been very, very, very good to me. The franking was 4,100 reais in this instance. 3,000 reais paid for the 1,500 to 3,000 kilometer distance for 20 grams. And now the ordinary government rate has now increased to 700 reais. And then there's a 400 reais registration fee. So you're looking at 1920, 1930 when there's the next rate increase for Brazilian mail. I believe that this was an inauguration of a first flight, according to the auxiliary marking. We're almost through with the domestic developments because basically you have the airline completed in Brazilian areas by 1935, 1936. Simultaneously, you have the internationalization of service, the cabotage, which someone was asking, or contracts. Condor extends service in September of 1930 into the Brazilian rainforest with intermediary points involving Caruma at the Bolivian border and Cuiabá in Brazil, 230 miles away from Caruma. I believe the final destination for Caruma in this instance was La Paz, and we'll be talking about that in a few moments. This was a first flight. It was an inauguration of a first flight. This evolved eventually into the route between Recife and Caruma and Puerto Suarez, and also in Bolivia and La Paz. The connection there was to Recife and Pernambuco to catch up again with FAM 6 and 10, as well as the Zeppelin flights when they had begun in 1930. And you can see in this instance, 800 reais was paid, 500 was paid for the cost of the service, and 300 for the government rate. And this is still in 1930. So I'm not sure what took place as to whether someone had failed to recognize that there had been a change in the rates from 300 to 500 to 700, or maybe there was a special rate that was still retained. You have MP again. Now, here you get the indication that what I was saying before, as I found someplace that said, hey, this was indicated that the item had been carried outside of the postal system by the airline part of its journey. But that may have been a misunderstanding on my part when I first did this 15 years ago. This was 1930, and I think I had mentioned that the first flight had been occurred in 1927. New rates had taken effect on September 30th, 1930, for a 10-week period. Again, this is one of those that may have not been properly franked because the rates had increased, but the folks in Porto Alegre were using the rates before 1930. So, you just don't know how to explain some of these incidences that take place that can't be documented as, legitimate because, new regulations were in effect. I don't know that I've shown you the ones with the Syndikat Condor logo up the upper left-hand corner. But in point of fact, that logo had begun way back when with SCADA in Colombia, and Condor just simply picked it up and transposed it to Brazil when they started introducing service. This is a flight between Florianopolis to Rio de Janeiro, and it was the first route established by Condor at the inauguration of service in January 1st of 1927. It is not known whether the intermediate stop at Santos of 4 years earlier was still being used. So there was an intermediary flight between the terminuses of Florianopolis and Rio de Janeiro. And in this instance, I don't know if it was still going, part of the connection. 700 reais for the ordinary government rate within the country. And again, the rate drops for ordinary government usage. The bottom one is a little different, and it's only different because we have a nut who loves absolutely meter mail, and he just was drooling on this. He said, "Sir, you never find meter mail on Condor mail of Brazil in the 1920s and 1930s." So I, of course, had to take this one out and included that meter mail is at the upper left-hand corner, and it's just for illustration purposes for you. I wasn't exploring the envelope and everything else. It was just the presentation of meter mail. And he was one of the ones that was absolutely enthused when the meter mail catalog came out. What do we have here? Cover to Florianopolis. By now, the Condor Company stamps have been replaced by regular Brazilian issues. Let me just pose this question for you, because this happened to me at a stamp show about 9-10 years ago. Have any of you ever tried to find the Condor stamps in Scott's catalog? Anybody? If you have, you won't find them. They're not cited as regular airmail. They're not cited as semi-postals, etc. But they were officially used by the airlines and given recognition on the part of the Brazilian government for usage in that period 1927 to 1930 for the sole purpose of helping pay for airmail service operated by Condor and by Varig, by the way. So you're never going to find them. Someone came up to ask me, "Where do you know all this stuff?" I said, "Because I happen to study the covers, and you're not going to find them." He said, "Well, how much are they worth?" I don't know exactly how much they're worth, and people put up prices left and right for these things. This matched the rate. Again, you'll see it's a 900 reais rate of September 1930 for the distance and the 200 reais. Neither one of these covers show signs of carriage by Condor. However, since Condor was the sole airline providing service to Rio Grande from outside areas controlled by the rebels, it is likely that they each saw service from that airline. And what are we talking about? A rebellion that took place in Brazil between 1932 and 1934, known as the Paulista Rebellion, because of disputes over who had won the election. And the rebels had their origin in Sao Paulo. They controlled the area in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo. And, the airline had to traverse it. So I have no doubt in my mind that these were carried by Condor. The Condor, the rates again are 700 reais. Now, the bottom one does not match any of the rates known at the time, so I'm not quite sure what took place here. I can't explain what took place here as to who was carrying this. Censor tape was being used. I believe it was through Sao Paulo and the Paulistas. But basically, you also have the Chaco War being fought between Bolivia and Paraguay, and I'm sorry for the misspelling, that may have, for some reason, intercepted this cover, opened it up, and sealed it again. We have an example here from April of 1936, from Rio de Janeiro to Belém in the northern part of the country. The first flight cover. This is extension of the Condor service to Belém in the far north for connection to Pan American. The franking is 1,000 reais. But again, I can't find it. This is extraordinarily low for the distances covered. And I can't explain it. Now, it may have been a favor cover. You'll see favor covers issued by Condor in the next few minutes. Oh, wait, I only have one in the next few minutes. Most of the favorite covers come up with respect of the rates in part 2. But I'll show you one example of a favorite cover, but this may have been a favorite cover from the Federal District in southern Brazil to Belém. Someone went a little bit crazy on the cancellations. This is a September 1940 Florianopolis to, I can't pronounce the name, Itajaí, I believe, which was a riverfront community that lay approximately 100 miles from the Atlantic. Again, there wasn't crossing of the country of the rainforest until late in development. Brazilians tend to be interested very much so in Condor, Varig, and the Zeppelins. You can generally find them, but many of them don't speak English. And I certainly don't speak Portuguese. This is Porto Alegre. The red instructional note indicates that Condor is to place the mail on the SS Cap Arcano. What we're talking about here was a very unusual arrangement. Plane to ship to plane. It wasn't catapult. Oh, do I have it turned around? It may have been ship to plane to ship. I don't remember which one it is. I need to look at my notes here. The rate paid and the CDS date show that it was not carried on the aboard of plane to sea to plane service. What it was intended for the SS Capricorno, but it didn't make it. So it wasn't carried on that particular means of transporting mail to Africa. And here you had special rates of 900 reais. You can see some of the information that Condor Wall flying boat was being used in 1930. It was followed by a transfer to a Lufthansa flight in Europe. Here's the map. You can see the towns and the cities all the way up to Germany. You can see the extensions into Chile after negotiations, the extensions from Argentina, etc., and those in Uruguay. This one was, wait, come back for that one. If we ever get back to it, what a story you could tell. This one. It was a bogus thing, and I think it was just simply hand-carried by a passenger on a ship from Argentina to South Africa, and then it got picked up. I could tell us, wonderful story. I just fell in love with it. World War II basically marks the end of Condor. For those unfamiliar with it, World War II begins. Germany has to sever its flights across Europe and Africa and to Brazil. An airline by the name of LATI, Linea Aerea Trasporti Italiani, had begun in late 1938. Italy was a neutral country until 1940, when it enters the war, and one Franklin Roosevelt makes reference to it as the stab in the back on France when Italy invades Marseille, one of those towns in the south, and takes over as part of the area. And until then, Italy had flight rights across and continued to fly across the Atlantic to Brazil and connect up with Condor. Condor is forced to cease supporting the LATI connection, not by the direct challenge on the part of the United States, because the president of Brazil was considered pro-fascist. But the United States said, well, you don't want to continue these flights, we'll cut off the supply of gasoline and aviation fuel to the airline. It didn't take too long for the Brazilians to digest that information and cease operations in basically December of 1941, about December 10th, 1941. And they continued operating for a few more months, but then the Condor ceased to exist.
Sergio, when did Varig cease to exist?
Varig was an airline that was established in 1924 in Brazil. By 1926, it was in search of additional aircraft. The Syndikat Condor offered aircraft in exchange for part ownership in Varig. Varig and Condor continued to grow in the next decade and a half. And they continued so until 1939. However, with the onset of the war, that is World War II, concerns began being expressed by the British and Americans about Germans flying Condor's airplanes over the Pacific, over the Atlantic, and engaging in espionage on shipping. Soon, the United States decided to request of Brazil that the relationship between Condor and the airline known as LATI be terminated. That occurred in 1941, in the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942. Varig continued throughout the 1940s, throughout the 1950s, throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, until the 1990s, when it incurred the same problems as Pan American from deregulated airmail and low-cost competition. Varig was broken up into two parts, both of which succumbed in 1933 at almost the same time as Pan American. So the answer to your question is 1993 is when Varig ceased.
Next question. Where did you acquire all of this information?
It's a good question and again, a difficult one to answer. I think you have to understand that I did this exhibit about 15, 20 years ago, when the internet was in its mid-age, and hadn't quite reached a lot of places in South America. Therefore, I had to use what literature was available, and it was limited, as well as covers illustrating the flights of Condor. And what you did basically was study the Condor covers to see what rates were being used, where they were flying, etc. And then positing that against maps to try and figure out what the flight arrangements were. There were several sites, including the Brazilian Philatelic Association of the United States, that explained partially the Condor system. There were additionally several books that were very dated explaining the development and evolution. So in effect, basically, it was by osmosis that I acquired the information and put it together in an exhibit. And that was the final product. And this is the expansion of that and presentation of that product.
Okay. Next, tell us about Sanabria.
This was a question comment raised during the initial Zoom presentation by a couple of members of the American Airmail Society. It was a comment made to me following a question or a comment that I posed to the audience. And the issue was that I posed to the audience was, go and look at Scott's catalog and see if you can find any of the Condor stamps. You will never find them. That question had been posed to me by dealers at different shows, and I could never find it for them or explain it to them. However, the Sanabria catalog of the late 1930s, as revised in the 1940s and in the beginning of 1972, conveying information on the Condor stamps that were officially recognized as semi-officials by Brazil. And the reason for this is Condor was able to sell the stamps to help pay for the airline services and did not have to pay the government for those. Synabria does list them, but the information is way out of date. It's outmoded. What did transpire with Synabria was it was purchased by a gentleman here in Colorado by the name of Steve Datz. He managed to revise the first section of it before he passed away. I don't know who now owns the rights to Synabria or whether it's ever going to be revised.
What can you tell us about William Kriebel?
Mr. Kriebel was an author who specialized in Brazilian AML and Brazilian postal history. During the 1980s and early 1990s, he wrote a series of articles that appeared in serial form in the Air Post Journal. Those articles were fantastic sources of information for me on the Condor Syndikat airline and its services. In the late 1990s or early 2000s, he came out with a book that converted the serialized articles into a full piece of literature dealing with Brazilian airlines. It is a fantastic book to have in your library if you are interested in that particular subject of South American Airlines. Thank you.
Okay. Where did the Condor logo come from?
Syndikat Condor bought SCADA in the 1920s, in the mid-1920s. They introduced the Condor logo for the airline known as SCADA, which operated out of Colombia and continued servicing in South America through the United States. The condor is the largest bird in South America. When SCADA attempted to get aviation rights into Central America and the United States, it was denied permissions to do so because of American concern about flights by a potential adversary, and Germany had been an adversary of the United States just 5-6 years earlier, flying over the Panama Canal. Condor then rid itself of its connection with SCADA and took its operations into Brazil. They also took the logo of the Condor and put it on its stationery. And that was a green logo, sometimes in blue, that appeared on many envelopes and covers flown by Condor.
Okay. We've noticed that several of the covers had different government rates. Can you explain the rate increases?
Sure. This was a question raised by members of the audience who noticed that one of the stamps on Brazilian Condor covers kept on changing in value. And those stamps were the stamps that were used for paying the government rate. Remember that the Condor pieces contained the rate for the ordinary government fees, as well as the special Condor stamps that paid for, okay, Condor services in the transport of the mail. The ordinary rate began in 1926 at 300 reais. Within 2 years, it had been increased to 500 reais. And by 1929, it had increased to 700 reais, and by 1930, 1,000 reais. So there was a steady increase in the ordinary government rate. I don't know how these increases were implemented by the government or Condor. I don't know who initiated the rate increases or whether those were just simply increases that the government did without talking with the Condor company. In any case, those rates changed over a 5-year period, and as indicated, went from 300 to 1,000 reais. Folks, I wanted to take a moment to explain something that you may have noticed. That specifically is I appeared differently on this video because we had to record it 3 different times. And that resulted from breakups in the internet connectivity that we have. And specifically, I'm saying to you is we cannot control the transmissions of whirring satellites 3,000, 4,000 miles above us. And so we've had to kind of reshoot this several occasions. Our apologies for that, but that's the explanation as to why I look differently. You want to ask a question?
Sergio, tell us about cabotage.
During the course of the presentation, a question was asked about this, and unfortunately, I didn't understand what the nature of the question was. I thought it was something else. Cabotage refers to the transportation of materials between nations. And in the case of aviation, it's known as aviation cabotage. Aviation cabotage allows nations and countries or airlines to overfly a country to get to another country for delivery of passengers and mail and cargo. It also allows airlines to operate within those nations that are overflown. Aviation cabotage agreements have got to be reached between parties concerned. In the case of Condor, Condor was able to fly over Paraguay and Bolivia without any agreements being reached. I don't know why, but they permitted Condor to fly over. In the case of Argentina and Uruguay and the contracts reached. And those contracts allowed Condor to fly in for specific purposes and events. That, unfortunately, did not extend to them cabotage rights to overfly those countries. Those contracts is the way I'd answered the question, but that was not what aviation cabotage was, and that was explained to me during the course of the initial presentation. I don't know when aviation cabotage rights were extended to Condor for those 3 countries, and I know they didn't have aviation cabotage rights into other South American countries or over the Caribbean. And that's the best answer I can provide to that question, Gary.
All right, thank you.
The final segment of my comments for you folks is this one, and that is suggestions and for follow-up in current day research, literature, etc. As I pointed out, over the course of the last 15, 18 years, the resources available on the internet in terms of web pages and websites have really expanded tremendously for South America. You have to really kind of know some of the names of the many clubs that have got web pages and the sites that have got web pages, but those can generally be found easily. I would point you out to those as sources of information, as one source of information. In particular, I'd mention the Sao Paulo Philatelic Association's webpage. Its webpage prominently displays one of the first Zeppelin covers. Let me correct that. One of the first Condor covers issued in 1926. Those Condor covers are extremely rare because they were rubber stamped with a triangular rubber stamp for the Condor Company, which were inadvertently mistaken as auxiliary markings. Most of those covers were destroyed and not saved. But those philatelic associations and their discussions will provide you information on Brazilian airmail. A second source is one I already mentioned, the Brazilian Philatelic Association located here in the United States, and they have wide-ranging discussions on all aspects of Brazilian airmail. Some of the literature had been mentioned, and I pointed out to you the Crivo book on Brazilian airmail. There's another source that I'd like to mention, together with another internet source that is really somewhat hard to find. The first one I'll mention is the Mi Oficina Philatelic Society webpage. That started about 5 years ago, and since then, they have dedicated themselves to exploring all things of a philatelic nature from South America. They have nearly 600 presentations that have been recorded and are available to the public. Those 600 pages or 600 videos are in Spanish invariably, but there are some in English. Gary Withrow, for example, our videographer, has had one presented on airmail etiquettes, and many of those involve South America, and that's done in English. The presentations themselves can be translated into English using a universal translator. Of those 600, a playlist of 16 aviation topics were developed as a result of the request made by us about whether they have any. Of those 16, 3 of them are in Spanish and focus in on Condor. Highly recommended site for all of you that are interested in South American philately. There is another source that I can never remember its location, but it is a blog site operated from Ecuador, again in Spanish. That blog site contains hundreds and hundreds of discussions about South American philately. Undoubtedly, there are some in there on the Condor. Thank you, Gary. Hello, folks, again. My name's Sergio Lugo, and I'm doing this. We've done this presentation for the American Airmail Society and the Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library of Denver. I'm going to make some brief remarks about both organizations. The American Airmail Society is a national organization with roughly 600 to 700 members throughout the United States and the country and the world. It hosts regular meetings in different locations, particularly at stamp shows. It has a web page in which various items of information are made available to the public. Through the work of Gary Withrow, our videographer here, he has managed to arrange discussion groups of a video nature that are on Zoom. And those are held monthly at very scheduled times that are announced to the public. And you are, as Zoom members, welcome to join them in those Zoom conversations. This was an initial Zoom meeting of about an hour and a half that we reduced down to about 45, 48 minutes in modifying the Zoom. We will now then modify it further into a managed video, which will be forthcoming in the future, that will have this basic presentation down to about 30 minutes, together with some additional parts for other discussion aspects of Condor Airline. The American ML Society welcomes your questions, discussion, and participation in aviation postal history. The Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library is located in Denver, Colorado. We operate on the basis of hourly meetings and hourly openings 6 days a week from the hours of 10 to 4. We don't have meetings on Sunday. On Thursdays, we extend those hours to 5 to 8 p.m. in the evening. The Rocky Mountain Philatelic Library is located at 2038 South Pontiac Way. We welcome all visitors who want to stop in and talk about philately. We have become one of the largest libraries in the country dedicated to philately. We have nearly 500 members with 14,000 books on our stacks and thousands and thousands and thousands of journals in the nearly 800 journals that we have. With that, we thank you for your participation, and we hope to see you again in future videos.